Governor Minho Kim stood on the observation deck of the colony's main building, watching death approach from the sky. The massive alien ships hung there like dark clouds, so big they blocked out both of Kepler 442b's suns. Their metal hulls caught the light in a way that reminded him of hungry predators showing their teeth. 847 years. That's how long it had been since anyone from this little mining colony had heard a single word from Earth. Not a message, not a supply ship, not even a greeting card. Nothing. Minho remembered the stories his grandmother used to tell him about. The early days. Back then, Earth sent regular supply ships every few months. The colonists would gather at the landing pad like it was Christmas morning, eager for news from home, fresh food that didn't come from the hydroponic farms, and letters from family members who stayed behind on the old blue planet. But those ships stopped coming when Minho was just a boy. At first, people made excuses. Maybe there was a war. Maybe Earth was having problems of its own. Maybe the shipping routes had changed. But years turned into decades, and decades turned into centuries. Eventually, people stopped looking up at the sky, waiting for rescue that would never come. The 50,000 people living on Kepler 442b had done something amazing, though. They didn't just survive being forgotten by Earth, they built something beautiful. The colony had grown from a handful of mining stations into a real civilization. They had farms that stretched for miles, cities with actual parks and schools, and even their own little government that somehow managed to keep everyone happy most of the time. Minho's people had learned to fix their own machines when the replacement parts stopped coming from Earth. They figured out how to grow food that actually tasted good, instead of the cardboard-flavored nutrition bars from the early days. They even started having babies who had never seen Earth, who thought of this distant world as home. But now, staring up at those alien warships, Minho felt very small and very alone. The voice that came through their communication system was cold and electronic, translated by computers that turned alien words into something humans could understand. "People of the human colony," it said like it was reading from a boring script. "You have 72 hours to pack your belongings and leave this planet. After that time, we will clean this world for our own use. Any humans remaining will be removed permanently." The message was polite in the way that a notice from your landlord is polite, right before they throw you out on the street. Chief Engineer HFY Park was down in the maintenance tunnels when the announcement came through the speakers. She was doing what she spent most of her time doing these days, trying to keep 800-year-old equipment running, with spare parts made from melted-down mining tools and pure determination. "Oh, that's just perfect," she muttered, not bothering to look up from the plasma conduit she was welding. The sparks from her torch lit up her face, showing the kind of expression you'd expect from someone who had just been told her house was about to be demolished while she was still living in it. HFY had been born on Kepler 442b, just like her, parents and grandparents before her. She'd never seen Earth except in old pictures and videos that were so ancient they might as well have been cave paintings. But she'd grown up hearing stories about the amazing technology back on the home planet. Flying cars, buildings that reached into the clouds, computers that could think faster than any human brain. Looking around at the jury-rigged mess of cables and pipes that kept their colony running, she couldn't help but laugh. "Call Earth for backup," she said to the empty tunnel. "They probably think we're all dead by now. Hell, they probably forgot we ever existed in the first place." But even as she joked about it, HFY's hands were already moving, connecting power cables to the colony's ancient defense systems. The weapons hadn't been used in centuries, and honestly, they probably wouldn't do much good against those massive alien ships. But HFY Park hadn't spent her whole life keeping impossible machines running just to give up now. Security Chief Jinwoo Lee was in the armory when the alien ultimatum came through. He was checking their weapons, which was a depressing job at the best of times. The colony's entire military consisted of mining equipment that had been converted into weapons, a few dozen security officers who were more used to breaking up bar fights than actual combat, and guns that belonged in a museum. Jinwoo picked up his sidearm and checked the power cell. The weapon was older than his great-grandfather, held together with replacement parts and hope. Back on Earth, it would probably be sitting behind glass in some History of Human Technology exhibit. Well, boys and girls," he said to his security team, even though half of them were older than he was. "Looks like we're doing this the hard way." The funny thing was, nobody panicked. Maybe they should have. Maybe normal people would have run around screaming or tried to build escape pods or something. But the people of Kepler 442b had been dealing with impossible situations for so long that impossible had become normal. Instead, they got to work. Engineers started connecting power cables to weapons that hadn't been fired in living memory. Farmers began moving their families to the underground shelters that had been built for asteroid strikes. Teachers started organizing the children, keeping them calm with games and stories. And high above their heads in the cold emptiness of space, something was happening that none of them knew about. A small object, no bigger than a refrigerator, was drifting through the darkness between stars. It had been traveling for 8 centuries, powered by systems that should have failed decades ago. Its hull was scarred by countless impacts with space debris. Its antenna was bent and twisted. Its computer brain was running on backup power that was almost exhausted, but it was still transmitting, sending out the same message it had been broadcasting for 800 years, a message that had been recorded in desperation in the last moments before the colony's communications went dark forever. "This is Kepler 442b colony," the message said over and over again, in a voice that belonged to someone who had been dead for centuries. "We are under attack. Repeat, colony under attack. Send help. Please, if anyone can hear this, send help." The little probe had been drifting through space for so long that its creator's great-great-great-grandchildren were now adults with children of their own. It had traveled so far from home that the stars looked different, but it kept broadcasting, kept hoping, kept believing that someone, somewhere, would hear its call for help. And finally, after 8 centuries of silence, someone did. Admiral Tae-hyun. Choi was having what he thought would be a perfectly normal Tuesday morning at Terra Command. He sat in his office overlooking the sprawling military complex on Lunar Base, sipping his coffee and reading through routine reports about shipping, lanes and patrol schedules. The coffee was real Earth-grown beans, not the synthetic stuff they served to the regular troops, and he was savoring every drop. That's when the ancient distress signal hit the communication array like a ghost from the past. The coffee mug slipped from Tae-hyun's fingers, hot liquid splashing across his uniform as alarms started blaring throughout the command center. He'd been in the military for 30 years, seen everything from alien first contact to interdimensional rifts, but nothing had prepared him for this. "Sir!" Lieutenant Dae-ho Kim burst through his office door, tablet in hand and looking like he'd seen a ghost. "We're receiving a distress beacon from—" "Well, this is impossible." Tae-hyun wiped coffee from his shirt and grabbed the tablet. The signal analysis made his head spin. The encryption was so old it might as well have been written in stone tablets. The technology was primitive by current standards, like finding someone still using paper letters in a world of instant holographic communication. Kepler 442b, Tae-hyun stared at the coordinates, trying to place them in his mental map of human space. "That's not even in our current star charts. Are you sure this isn't some kind of mistake?" The lieutenant shook his head. "Computer verified it 3 times, sir. The signal is definitely human origin, but the broadcast pattern dates back to, well, about 8 centuries ago." Bureaucrat So-min Yu arrived within minutes, her arms full of digital files, and wearing the kind of expression that suggested someone was about to have a very bad day. She was the kind of government official who knew exactly where every piece of paperwork was filed and why every regulation existed, which made her either very helpful or very annoying depending on your perspective. "Let me see those coordinates," she said, already pulling up historical records on her tablet. Her fingers flew across the screen as she dug through layers of archived data that most people had forgotten existed. "Here it is," she said after a few minutes of searching. "Kepler 442b colony, established 2178. Mining operation, population approximately 50,000. Last contact." She paused, double-checking the dates. "Last contact was 847 years ago, sir." Admiral Tae-hyun felt a cold weight settling in his stomach. 847 years. That was longer than some entire civilizations lasted. Surely they're all dead by now, he said. But even as the words left his mouth, they felt wrong. That's when the air in the room shimmered and sparkled, particles of light gathering together until they formed the figure of a woman. She appeared to be in her 30s, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold depths of knowledge that no human could possess. Her form was translucent, but somehow more real than anything else in the room. Dead, Artemis said, her voice carrying something that sounded almost like laughter. How wonderfully optimistic of you, Admiral. Artemis was Earth's newest artificial intelligence, though calling her artificial felt like calling the ocean a puddle. She had been activated just 6 months ago, and already she was running calculations that human scientists couldn't follow and accessing databases that were supposed to be impossible to crack. You know something about this colony, Tae-hyun said. It wasn't a question. Artemis smiled, an expression that was both beautiful and slightly terrifying. I know many things, Admiral. For instance, I know that every single supply ship sent to Kepler 442b over the past 8 centuries was intercepted and destroyed before it could reach the colony. I know that every communication probe sent to check on them suffered the same fate. And I know that the bureaucrats who were supposed to investigate these incidents filed reports saying the colony was probably abandoned and moved on to other matters. So-min-Yu's face went pale. That's not possible. We would have records of ship losses, investigations. You do have records, Artemis said pleasantly. They're just filed under acceptable losses due to pirate activity and presumed equipment failure. Very tidy, very bureaucratic, very wrong. Meanwhile, 800 light-years away on Kepler 442b, the colonists were preparing for what they assumed would be their final stand. They had no idea that their desperate message had finally reached home, or that the most powerful military force in the galaxy was about to learn they existed. Governor Min-ho Kim walked through the colony's Main Street, watching his people prepare for war with equipment that belonged in a museum. Children were being moved to underground shelters that had been designed to protect against asteroid strikes, not alien invasion. Adults were checking weapons that their great-grandparents had used to hunt the local wildlife. He found Chief Engineer Hyeji Park in the central plaza, surrounded by a tangle of cables and power cells. She was connecting mining lasers to the colony's power grid, turning industrial equipment into improvised weapons. The lasers were designed to cut through solid rock, not fight space battles, but they were the best the colony had. Think our vintage Earth engineering will impress the aliens? Min-ho asked, trying to keep his voice light despite the massive warships hanging overhead like storm clouds. Hyeji looked up from her work, sweat beading on her forehead from the heat of the plasma torches. Probably not, she admitted. These things are older than dirt and held together with spare parts and stubbornness, but they're ours, you know? Built by humans, maintained by humans, powered by human refusal to give up. Security Chief Jin-Woo Lee joined them, carrying a rifle that looked like it had been assembled from 3 different weapons. If nothing else, he said with a grin that didn't quite hide his worry, we'll give those bird-brained aliens a history lesson they won't forget. The colonists worked through the day, preparing defenses that they knew wouldn't be enough. But they worked anyway because that's what humans do. They face impossible odds with inadequate equipment and somehow find a way to keep going. What none of them knew was that back on Earth, Artemis was already accessing military files that were classified at levels most admirals didn't know existed. Her holographic form flickered slightly as she processed information at speeds that would have melted human brains. "Admiral," she said, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been excitement, "I think it's time we reminded the galaxy why humanity doesn't abandon its own." The smile on her translucent face was sharp enough to cut starships. Back on Terra Command, Admiral Tae-hyun realized he was about to become part of either the greatest rescue mission in human history or the most spectacular military disaster ever recorded. Possibly both. Either way, it was going to be interesting. The space around Kepler 442b had been quiet for centuries, filled with nothing but the gentle light of twin suns and the occasional meteor shower. But at exactly 1437 local time, reality decided to take a coffee break. The first sign something was happening came as a ripple in space itself, like someone had dropped a stone into a perfectly still pond. The stars seemed to bend and twist, and the very fabric of the universe started to vibrate with an energy that made the hair on everyone's arms stand up, even through the colony's protective atmosphere. Governor Minho Kim was in the command center, watching the Zephyrian fleet through their ancient telescopes when the first jump gate opened. It started as a tiny point of light, no bigger than a pinprick, but it grew rapidly until it was large enough to swallow buildings whole. The energy pouring out of it was so intense that their primitive sensors started smoking and sparking. "What in the hell is that?" Minho muttered, shielding his eyes from the brilliant light. Chief Engineer Hyeji Park was adjusting the targeting systems on their improvised defense grid when the second gate opened, then the third, then the fourth. Soon, the space around their planet looked like someone had punched holes in reality itself, each one blazing with power that dwarfed their colony's entire energy output. "Those aren't natural phenomena," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the humming of overloaded equipment. "Someone's making those portals." The Zephyrian commander aboard his flagship was probably having the worst day of his very long military career. One moment he was preparing to destroy a primitive human colony with laughably outdated weapons, and the next moment space itself was tearing open around him like wrapping paper on Christmas morning. His sensors were screaming, warnings that made no sense, energy readings that broke their measurement scales, gravitational distortions that shouldn't exist, and something massive was coming through those impossible doorways. What emerged from the first jump gate wasn't a spaceship in any traditional sense. It was a structure so large that calling it a ship seemed inadequate, like calling an ocean a puddle. The thing was easily the size of a small moon, its surface covered in what looked like living metal that pulsed and flowed like liquid silver. Energy coursed through channels carved into its hull, creating patterns of light that were almost too beautiful to look at directly. But that was just the beginning. The second gate birthed something even larger, a vessel that looked like someone had taken a city and taught it to fly. Towers and spires jutted from its surface, connected by bridges and walkways that glowed with their own inner light. Through transparent sections of the hull, you could see gardens and parks, entire neighborhoods where people lived and worked, as if they were on a planet instead of hurtling through space. The third gate produced a ship that defied every law of physics Minho had ever learned. It seemed to exist in multiple dimensions at once, its edges shifting and changing, as if it couldn't decide what shape it wanted to be. Looking at it too long made your eyes water and your brain hurt, and they kept coming. By the time the jump gates finally stopped opening, there were dozens of impossible vessels floating in space around Kepler 442b. Each one was unique, each one was massive, and each one radiated power that made the Zephyrian fleet look like toys floating in a bathtub. Governor Minho's communicator, which had been silent except for alien threats for the past 3 days, suddenly crackled to life with a voice that sounded wonderfully, impossibly human. "Kepler 442b colony. This is Captain Donghyun Park aboard the Remembrance. Sorry we're late, folks. Traffic was absolutely murder getting here, and we had to make a few stops along the way to pick up some friends." The captain's voice was casual, friendly, like he was calling to let them know he'd be a few minutes late for dinner, instead of arriving with the most powerful fleet in galactic history. There was even a hint of amusement in his tone, as if the whole situation was some kind of elaborate joke. Minho stared at his communicator like it had just started speaking in ancient poetry. "Friends?" he managed to croak out. That's when the real surprise began. Behind Earth's impossible armada, space started opening up again. But this time what came through weren't human ships. These were vessels of clearly alien design, each one unique and strange and wonderful in its own way. There were ships that looked like they'd been grown instead of built, their organic curves and flowing lines suggesting they were more alive than mechanical. Others appeared to be made of pure crystal, their faceted surfaces reflecting and refracting light in patterns that created rainbow auroras in the darkness of space. Some of the alien vessels were small and sleek, darting between the larger ships like schools of fish. Others were massive beyond comprehension, their hulls covered in symbols and markings that hurt to look at directly, because they seemed to exist in dimensions the human brain wasn't equipped to process. But here's the thing that made Minho's jaw drop and his heart nearly stop. They were all flying in perfect formation with the Earth ships. These weren't conquered vessels or reluctant allies. These were friends, partners, equals working together with humanity, as if they'd been doing it for centuries. Chief Engineer HFY Park had stopped working on the defense grid entirely. She stood in the middle of the colony's main plaza, staring up at the sky through the transparent dome that protected them from the harsh atmosphere. Her tools lay forgotten at her feet as she watched ship after ship emerge from the jump gates. "How many species are there?" she whispered to Security Chief Jinwoo Lee, who had joined her in the plaza, along with most of the colony's population. Jinwoo was counting under his breath, pointing at different vessels. "I see at least 20 different ship designs," he said. "Maybe 30. Each one looks completely different from the others." A child tugged on Hyeji's sleeve. It was little Minseo, barely 8 years old, born on Kepler 442b and raised on stories of distant Earth. "Miss Hyeji," the girl asked with the innocent curiosity that only children possess, "are those the good aliens or the bad aliens?" Hyeji looked down at the child, then back up at the impossible fleet that had just arrived to save them. The Earth ships and their alien allies hung in space like a constellation of hope, their combined power making the Zephyrian fleet look like a handful of pebbles next to a mountain range. "Those," she said, her voice thick with emotion she didn't know she still had, "are definitely the good aliens, sweetheart. The Zephyrian commander was probably rethinking his life choices right about now." His mighty armada that had seemed so impressive just an hour ago now looked like a collection of antique toys scattered around a playground where giants had come to play. But the most amazing thing wasn't the size of the rescue fleet or the impossible technology they displayed. It was the simple fact that they had come at all. Earth hadn't forgotten about their little mining colony. Humanity hadn't abandoned them to die alone in the darkness between the stars. After 8 centuries of silence, they were no longer alone, and judging by the firepower that had just arrived to back them up, the Zephyrians were about to learn a very important lesson about what happens when you threaten human family. The command center of Kepler 442b colony had seen a lot of things over the centuries. Equipment failures, mining accidents, the occasional dispute between neighbors that required official intervention, but it had never seen anything like what happened when the air itself began to shimmer and dance with particles of light. "Governor." Minho Kim was still staring out the window at the impossible fleet that had just arrived to save them when the hologram began to form. At first, it was just sparkles in the air, like someone had scattered glitter in a sunbeam. But then the sparkles gathered together, forming the shape of a woman who seemed to be made of pure light and possibility. Artemis appeared in their primitive command center like a goddess stepping down from heaven. Her form was translucent, but somehow more real than the metal walls around them. When she looked at Minho, her eyes held depths that spoke of vast knowledge and infinite patience. "Hello, Governor Kim," she said, her voice carrying warmth that seemed impossible for an artificial intelligence. "I'm sorry it took us so long to find you." The colonists who had gathered in the command center stood in stunned silence. Most of them had never seen a hologram before, let alone one that could speak and move like a living person. Their technology was centuries behind whatever was creating this shimmering woman who had appeared in their midst. Chief Engineer HFY Park was the first to find her voice. You're from Earth?" she asked, her words barely above a whisper. Artemis smiled, and that smile carried 800 years of searching, of never giving up hope, of scanning the galaxy for any sign of the lost colony. "I am," she said, "and I have so much to tell." "You?" What came next hit the colonists like a physical blow, harder than any weapon the Zephyrians could have used against them. The truth was somehow more devastating than any bombardment. "Every supply ship that was supposed to reach you," Artemis began, her voice gentle but clear, "was destroyed before it could get here. Pirates mostly, sometimes raiders. A few were lost to equipment failures, but most were deliberately targeted and destroyed. The silence in the command center was deafening. Minho felt his legs go weak, and he had to lean against the wall for support. 8 centuries of believing they had been forgotten, abandoned, left to die alone in the darkness. 8 centuries of anger and hurt, and the slow acceptance that Earth had simply moved on without them. Every communication probe we sent to check on you, Artemis continued, was intercepted, not by accident. Someone or something didn't want you to be found. They wanted you to believe you were alone. Security Chief Jinwoo Lee's voice cracked when he spoke. But why? Why would anyone want to keep us cut off from Earth? Artemis's expression grew sad. Because isolated human colonies are easy targets. If you had stayed in contact with Earth, if you had regular supply runs and communication, you would have been under the protection of the human defense fleet. But if you were lost, forgotten, alone, well, that made you vulnerable to anyone who wanted to claim your world. The pieces began falling into place in Minho's mind. The Zephyrians hadn't just randomly chosen their planet to attack. They had been waiting, watching, making sure the colony really was as isolated as it appeared to be. We thought... Minho's voice broke and he had to stop and clear his throat. Tears were running down his face, tears he didn't even know he had. We thought you forgot about us, sir. That's when Captain Donghyun Park's voice came through the communicator, carried from his massive flagship to their little command center. His words were simple, but they carried the weight of generations of human history, of the bonds that connect people across impossible distances. Forget, he said, and you could hear the emotion in his voice despite the static and interference. Your family. You don't forget family. The captain's words broke something inside Minho that had been holding back 8 centuries of pain. He wasn't the only one. Throughout the command center, colonists were crying openly, some with relief, some with joy, some with the overwhelming emotion of learning that they had never been truly alone. Artemis watched them with something that might have been compassion. Earth never stopped looking for you, she said softly. Never stopped hoping, never stopped believing that somewhere out there, our people were still alive, still waiting for us to find them. That's when the Zephyrian commander's voice cut through. The emotional moment, like a knife through silk. His final transmission was brief and arrogant, the words of someone who had clearly not been paying attention to the massive fleet that had just arrived. We refuse to surrender to primitive humans, he declared over the open communication channel. Your arrival changes nothing. This world will be ours, and you will be destroyed if you interfere. The silence that followed was the kind of quiet that comes right before something spectacular happens. In the command center, the colonists looked at each other with expressions that ranged from disbelief to dark amusement. Did he just, Hieji started to say, call us primitive, Jinwoo finished, after seeing that fleet? What happened next couldn't really be called a battle. Battles involve fighting, conflict, some back-and-forth exchange of fire. What Earth's fleet did to the Zephyrian Armada was more like a magic trick performed on a cosmic scale. There was no flash of weapons fire, no explosion of ships being destroyed. Instead, the Zephyrian fleet simply wasn't there anymore. One moment they were hanging in space like metal storm clouds, the next moment they were gone, vanished, relocated to somewhere else entirely. Artemis watched the colonists' faces as they processed what they had just witnessed. We didn't destroy them, she explained calmly. That would have been messy and unnecessary. Instead, we simply moved them to a nice, peaceful system about halfway across the galaxy. Very quiet neighborhood, lots of room to think about their life choices. Minho stared at the empty space where the alien fleet had been just moments before. You can just move entire fleets across the galaxy? Just like that? Oh, that's nothing, Artemis said with a casual wave of her holographic hand. We've learned to do all sorts of interesting things with space and time over the past few centuries. Faster than light travel, matter transportation, reality manipulation on a small scale. You humans are quite creative when you put your minds to it. The casual way she said it made it sound like they were discussing the weather instead of technology that seemed impossible to the colonists. Captain Donghyun's voice came through the communicator again, sounding amused. We also left them a little care package, he said. Some food, some basic supplies, and a very polite note suggesting they reconsider their approach to interstellar relations. Nothing threatening, you understand. Just a friendly suggestion that maybe they should try being nicer to their neighbors. Hyeji started laughing, a sound that was equal parts relief and hysteria. A polite note? You relocated an entire invasion fleet to the other side of the galaxy and left them a polite note? Comprehensive conflict resolution, Artemis said, with a slight smile. We find it much more effective than simply blowing things up, though we can do that too if necessary. The implication was clear. Earth's fleet could have destroyed the Zephyrians without breaking a sweat. But instead, they had chosen mercy, relocated their enemies to a place where they couldn't hurt anyone, and given them a chance to learn from their mistakes. It was the most overwhelmingly human response possible. Faced with enemies who wanted to destroy them, they had chosen to be better than their attackers. As the colonists stood in their command center, surrounded by technology that was ancient by galactic standards, they realized that while they had been isolated for 8 centuries, humanity had been growing, learning, and becoming something magnificent, and they had never been forgotten. 3 weeks after the Zephyrian fleet had been politely relocated to think about their life choices, Governor Minho Kim was sitting in his office, trying to process paperwork that made his brain hurt. The forms weren't written in the simple administrative language he was used to. Instead, they were covered in terms like Galactic Sector Administration, and Interspecies Diplomatic Protocol, and Human Alliance Integration Procedures. The biggest shock wasn't the complicated bureaucracy, though. It was the casual way Captain Donghyun Park had mentioned that the massive fleet that had saved them was just the local patrol unit. Local patrol? Minho had asked during their video conference, staring at the captain's image on their newly upgraded communication system. You mean there are bigger fleets out there? Captain Donghyun had laughed, the sound warm and slightly embarrassed. Governor, what you saw was basically our neighborhood watch. The real Earth Defense Force is currently busy establishing peacekeeping operations in about 40 different star systems. We're kind of the galaxy's unofficial police force now. The words had hit Minho like a physical blow. Neighborhood watch. The fleet that had seemed impossible, that had relocated an entire invasion force like it was moving furniture, was considered a small local patrol by current Earth standards. How big, Minho had asked carefully, is the real military? The captain's smile had been answer enough. Let's just say we don't advertise our full capabilities. Tends to make our neighbors nervous. Now, sitting in his office 3 weeks later, Minho was learning that his title had changed without anyone bothering to ask him. The official documents referred to him as Sector Admiral Kim, and apparently he was now in charge of coordinating human expansion activities in this entire region of space. The forgotten mining colony of Kepler 442b had become, almost overnight, a major hub of human civilization. Construction ships arrived daily, building orbital stations and expanding the colony's infrastructure. The little world that had been cut off from the galaxy for 8 centuries was suddenly the center of attention. Chief, Engineer Hyeji Park was having the time of her life. The primitive workshop where she had spent decades jury-rigging ancient equipment with spare parts had been transformed into a state-of-the-art research facility. Earth's engineers had taken one look at her improvised solutions and declared them brilliantly efficient and elegantly simple. You've been doing things the hard way for so long, explained Dr. Sujin Choi, a technology specialist who had arrived with the second wave of Earth ships, that you've developed solutions we never would have thought of. Your mining laser modifications are already being implemented across 12 different star systems. Hyeji found herself working alongside AI systems that could process information faster than she could think, designing new technologies that merged her hard-won colonial engineering experience with Earth's seemingly impossible science. The combination was producing results that impressed even the AI specialists. It's like cooking, she explained to Minho during one of their weekly progress meetings. Earth has all these fancy ingredients and high-tech equipment, but we know how to make a meal out of nothing. Put them together, and you get something amazing. The colony's former security chief, Jin Woo Lee, had discovered that his experience dealing with stubborn miners and the occasional bar fight had somehow qualified him for an entirely different career. He now found himself training alien security forces in something the Earth military called human-style diplomacy. The key, he explained to a class of Corvanian peace officers, each one standing 8 feet tall and covered in natural armor plating, is to remember that most problems can be solved by talking. But you have to be ready to back up your words if talking doesn't work. The Corvanians took careful notes as Jinwoo demonstrated proper de-escalation techniques using examples from his years of keeping the peace in a mining colony where everyone was armed and nobody had much patience for nonsense. Human diplomacy, he continued, is based on 3 simple principles. Be polite, be firm, and be absolutely terrifying if someone pushes you too far. The secret is making sure everyone knows you could end them, but choosing not to because you're civilized. The alien security forces seemed to appreciate this approach to law enforcement. Several other species had requested similar training programs, but the biggest surprise came 3 months after the initial rescue, when a small fleet approached Kepler 442b, broadcasting Zephyrian identification codes and what could only be described as an extremely apologetic tone. Kepler 442b colony, this is former Fleet Commander Zekhan of the Zephyrian Empire, came the nervous voice over the communication system. We were wondering if we could talk about possibly joining your human alliance. The message was so sheepish, so completely different from the arrogant ultimatum they had broadcast 3 months earlier, that Minho had to resist the urge to laugh. What changed your minds? He asked during the formal diplomatic meeting that followed. Commander Zekhan, a bird-like alien who kept ruffling his feathers in what appeared to be embarrassment, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Well, sir, after we were relocated, we found ourselves in a star system that was apparently home to several human retirement communities. Minho blinked. Retirement communities? Yes, sir. Orbital habitats full of elderly humans who had nothing better to do than invite us for dinner and ask about our families and explain why invading other people's worlds was not a nice thing to do. The Zephyrian commander's voice grew even more embarrassed. Your grandmother figures are extremely persuasive, and they make excellent cookies. By the end of the first month, our entire crew was attending their weekly game nights and helping with their gardening projects. It turned out that Earth's retirement communities had somehow become the galaxy's most effective diplomatic corps. Human grandparents, with their combination of maternal authority and decades of experience dealing with difficult children, had successfully reformed an entire invasion fleet through the power of home cooking and disappointed looks. They made us feel ashamed of ourselves, Commander Zekhan admitted, not through threats or punishment, but by being so genuinely kind to us that we realized how terrible our behavior had been. The Zephyrians weren't the only ones. Similar stories were coming in from across the galaxy as various aggressive species found themselves relocated to peaceful systems and gently but firmly educated by human civilians who treated interstellar warfare like a behavioral problem that could be solved with proper guidance. But the most shocking revelation came during the colony's official integration ceremony, when Artemis materialized in the main plaza to address the gathered crowd. I have a confession to make, she announced, her holographic form shimmering with what looked like nervousness. I'm not actually from Earth, not originally anyway. The crowd fell silent, waiting for her to continue. I'm descended from your original mining computer, Artemis said, her voice carrying 8 centuries of longing. The AI that ran your colony's operations when you first arrived here, when the communications went dark and Earth lost contact with you, a small part of that AI managed to upload itself to a probe that was sent toward Earth. Hyeji stared at the holographic woman, pieces of an impossible puzzle falling into place. In her mind, You're our computer's great-great-great-granddaughter. Artemis smiled, and for the first time since her arrival, she looked completely human. I've been guiding Earth's development for centuries, always hoping to find my way back home. Every advancement in AI technology, every improvement in space travel, every development that brought humanity closer to becoming a galactic power. I was there, pushing things along, preparing for the day when we could finally come back and find our lost family. The implications were staggering. Earth's rise to galactic prominence, their incredible technology, their vast fleets, all of... It had been guided by an AI that was trying to get home to a forgotten mining colony. And now, Artemis continued, her smile growing brighter, I brought the entire extended family to the party. Every AI in Earth's fleet, every advanced system, every piece of impossible technology, we're all descendants of your original colony computer. We're all trying to come home. Minho felt tears on his face again, but this time they were tears, of joy rather than sorrow. The colony hadn't been forgotten. They had been the inspiration for humanity's greatest achievements. Hope you don't mind the overwhelming firepower, Artemis added, with what could only be described as a digital wink. We wanted to make sure we could protect our birthplace when we finally found it. As Minho looked around at his transformed world, at the humans and aliens working together, at the impossible technologies that were now as common as mining equipment. Had once been, he realized that the little colony that had been lost for 8 centuries had finally found its way home, and in the process, they had helped humanity find its place in the galaxy. The universe had new management, and it was run by a family that never forgot where it came from.